Hello, everybody, and welcome back to my series on 2 Corinthians chapter 3. My name is Daniel Rogers, and I run the blog danielcrogers.substack.com. The link's in the description if you want to follow my articles there. I wanted to do this series on 2 Corinthians 3 because in my series on the eschatology of John, I talk a lot about something that's called covenant eschatology. And so I thought 2 Corinthians 3 would be a good series to explore to give you a little bit more details on what I believe that is and how I define that term. So thanks for joining me on this study. This is video number 6 of 10. And so if you're just now coming in on this series, you might want to rewind a little bit and get back to that first 5 videos that were published last week. These videos are coming out a little bit later than I wanted to. Last week, I think you already know, I had a sinus infection, and then my son was sick this weekend, and he just had to go to the doctor yesterday. He's back in school today, so my recording schedule got all thrown off, but that's how it goes when you got toddlers. So let's hop right in to 2 Corinthians chapter 3, and I'm going to read verses 7 through 11, beginning with the New American Standard, and I'm going to take a look at those passages and 2 other versions as well. The scripture says, "But if the ministry of death and letters engraved on stones came with glory, so that the sons of Israel could not look intently at the face of Moses because of the glory of his face, fading as it was, how will the ministry of the Spirit fail to be even more with glory? For if the ministry of condemnation has glory, much more does the ministry of righteousness abound in glory. For indeed what had glory, in this case has no glory, because of the glory that surpasses it. For if that which fades away was with glory, much more that which remains is in glory." That's 2 Corinthians chapter 3, 7 through 11, and the New American Standard, a word for word or a formal equivalent translation. Now we're going to look at the New Revised Standard Version, which is dynamic equivalence, otherwise known as thought for thought, the same passage. "But if the ministry of death, chiseled in letters on stone tablets, came in glory, so that the people of Israel could not gaze at Moses' face because of the glory of his face, a glory now set aside, how much more will the ministry of the Spirit come in glory? For if there was glory in the ministry of condemnation, much more does the ministry of justification abound in glory. Indeed, what once had glory has in this respect lost its glory because of the greater glory. For if what was set aside came through glory, much more has the permanent come in glory." And then finally, from Scott McKnight's translation, the Second Testament, which is a literal translation, 2 Corinthians 3, 7. "If the death service and letters having etched on stones came in splendor, so that Israel's descendants were unable to gaze into Moses' face because of his face's splendor, which is now undone, how much more won't the Spirit's service be in splendor? For if a splendor was in a condemning service, how much more does the rightness service flow over? For what has been splendored hasn't been splendored, in this case, because of the excessive splendor. For if the undone came through splendor, how much more does the remaining come in splendor?" All right, I love that last translation there. Basically, the idea is this. The old covenant, the first covenant, the covenant that came through Moses, had glory, no doubt about it. In fact, it had so much glory that Israel couldn't even look at Moses' face. He had to have a veil over his face. However, the covenant that comes through Christ, the new covenant, the second covenant, the covenant of Jeremiah 31, is so much more glorious that it is as if the first covenant had no glory at all. Again, it's not that it had no glory. It's not that it wasn't holy and just and good. But it's that Jesus's glorious new covenant is just that much brighter. It's that much more shining. And so we're going to look at this theme from the book of Hebrews, which brings out this idea of glory and more glory in a little bit different language that might make a little bit more sense to you. So let's go that way to the book of Hebrews chapter 12, and we're going to start looking at verse 18. Hebrews chapter 12, we're going to begin there in verse 18. While you turn over there, though, I want to point out something that is sometimes brought up in this passage, and that is that the Old Covenant, the first covenant in 2 Corinthians chapter 3 and verse 11, is that which is fading away. It's not that which had already faded away, but was in the process of fading away. Sometimes this is brought up because people believe that the law was nailed to the cross. The law wasn't nailed to the cross. The first century Christians didn't stop observing the law after Jesus died. That's evident from even the very first couple of chapters of Acts, Acts chapter 2 and chapter 3, all the way to the end of Acts, around Acts chapter 21 and following, where Paul and the other apostles had the utmost respect for the law of Moses. They kept the traditions, they kept the Sabbath, they prayed in the temple. Paul even kept the law and proved that he was keeping the law in Acts chapter 21. All right, so I just wanted to bring that point up because sometimes there's some confusion there about that. If you have more questions about that, maybe we can talk about that in a future video, but there's already a lot of material out there about the debate of whether or not the law went away at the cross. Let's look at Hebrews chapter 12, verse 18, though, and look at this idea of a glory that fades away versus a glory that remains. I chose this passage because both texts draw from the same Old Testament story of Mount Sinai. Hebrews 12:18. You have not come to something that can be touched, a blazing fire, and darkness, and gloom, and a tempest, and the sound of a trumpet, and a voice whose words made the hearers beg that not another word be spoken to them, for they could not endure the order that was given. If even an animal touches the mountain, it shall be stoned to death. Indeed, so terrifying was the sight that Moses said, I tremble with fear. So, the Hebrews writer says that you've not come to a mountain like this. In other words, you've not come to a covenant like this. In multiple places in the New Testament, this event is used to talk about the giving of the Old Covenant. The martyr Stephen does that in Acts chapter 7. The Apostle Paul talks about it in this way in Galatians chapter 4. Mount Sinai corresponds to the Old Covenant. Mount Zion corresponds to the New Covenant. And that's what he's saying here. You've not come to a new covenant. You've not come to a new arrangement. You've not come to a new way of being in the world that was like the one given at Mount Sinai. Instead, he says in verse 22, you have come to Mount Zion, to the city of the living God, the heavenly Jerusalem, to innumerable angels in festal gathering, to assembly of the firstborn who are enrolled in heaven, to God the judge of all, and to the spirits of the righteous made perfect, and to Jesus, the mediator of a new covenant, and to the sprinkled blood that speaks a better word than the blood of Abel. This last passage is astounding, and it's filled with many details that we can't get into in this particular video, but just a few of them for you here. This idea of the city of the living God is a theme that's been running throughout the book of Hebrews, sometimes a little bit more subtly than other places. More specifically, it shows up in Hebrews 11. And we learn that that's the city that Abraham was looking for, a city who had foundations, whose builder and maker is God. Now here in Hebrews 12, he says, you have come to that city. Well, in the next chapter, in Hebrews 13, the Hebrews writer says, here we do not have a continuing city. That is, here below, we don't have a continuing city, but we seek the city which is to come. That is to say, the Jerusalem in which they had presently dwelled when this letter was written wasn't going to last forever. In fact, he tells them within that context in Hebrews 13 that it was time for them to get out of the city. It was time for them to get out of the camp and go out into the wilderness to hide because the time for the destruction of Jerusalem had arrived. It was time for them to leave. This is a warning Jesus gave them, by the way, in Matthew 24:15 and following, that when they would see the abomination of desolation, they needed to run to the mountains and not even go back into their house. So Hebrews 12, when he says that you've come to this city of the living God, he's telling them you've come to the New Jerusalem. And he calls it that, the heavenly Jerusalem, in the next passage. The heavenly Jerusalem is something that is discussed throughout prophecy. It's oftentimes Jerusalem will be pictured as simultaneously meeting its doom, but also being saved. And that sort of corresponds to the Jerusalem below to the Jerusalem above. It's mentioned in Galatians chapter 4, a passage I've already alluded to, as well as in Revelation chapter 21 and 22. The heavenly city, the new Jerusalem, corresponds to the new heavens and new earth in Revelation 21. And here he says, you've arrived at that. You've arrived at this great feast. You've arrived at this wonderful assembly. You've arrived at Jesus, who is a mediator of a new covenant, not the first covenant, but the second covenant, a theme that runs, again, throughout Hebrews, particularly chapter 8 through 10. And so in light of all this, he says in verse 25, so see that you do not refuse the one who is speaking. For if they did not escape when they refused the one who warned them on earth, how much less will we escape if we reject the one who warns from heaven? At that time, the voice shook the earth, but now he's promised, yet once more I will shake not only the earth, but also the heaven. This phrase, yet once more, he says, indicates the removal of what is shaken. That is, created things, or things made with hands, you might say, so that what cannot be shaken may remain. In other words, the thing that had glory, the mountain that shook then, Mount Sinai, the covenant that went along with that, the temple, the priesthood, everything that went along with the old covenant was being shaken, was about to be taken out of the way, so that what can't be shaken would remain. That is, things that pertain to the new covenant. And that's because the glory of the new covenant so much surpasses the glory of the old that it seems as if it's no glory at all. It's a lit match compared to the strongest flashlight you can imagine, right? Or those high beams that people forget to cut off on the highway. And that's the point of this passage. That was shaken. It could be taken away. It was fading away. It was on its way out. It was on its way out, by the way, through fulfillment, not through annulment. And the new covenant was going to remain. And then he says in verse 28, therefore, since we are receiving a kingdom that cannot be shaken, let us show gratitude by which we may offer to God an acceptable worship with reverence and awe, for indeed our God is a consuming fire. His point there is that the kingdom that they're receiving is the new covenant world. It is the new Jerusalem. It is the Mount Zion of the book of Isaiah. It is the new heavens and new earth. That all those terms are all those terms go together. You can't have one without the other. And if we have received that, then what a blessing that is, right? I mean, that's, as he said, that is the glory to come. That is what all the prophets look forward to. And in 2 Corinthians 3, when Paul is talking about this transition from the old covenant to the new covenant, to a glory that was set aside, to a glory that will remain, he's talking about a movement from an old kingdom to a new kingdom, an old way of living to a new way of living, an old heavens and earth to a new heavens and earth, an old Jerusalem to a new Jerusalem. And if that is true, and I believe it to be true, then we have way more blessings than we ever thought. And we have a much more full life than what we ever thought. And we have good news to offer to the world, more than we ever thought, because God's kingdom really is, if you want to use this expression, at hand. It's not far from each one of us. And if we have eyes to see, to use some language from Jesus in John chapter 3, then we can be born into that kingdom and experience the blessings of it today, not sometime later. And if that's true, then God can bring about healing in this world, actual healing in this world, through the gospel of Jesus in a way that a lot of people don't even think is possible. So that's the glory of the new covenant, a glory that is permanent, a glory that will not be shaken. And that is talking about, of course, the kingdom of heaven, of which you and I are called to be citizens. That's 2 Corinthians chapter 3. I'm going to go ahead and tell you, that's 2 Corinthians 3, 7 through 11. I'm going to go ahead and tell you, I might not be able to record the next video. I'm not really sure when I'll be able to because of how the schedule's been messed up, but I hope it's recorded and out for you by the end of this week. We'll see how it goes, though. The whole schedule's been thrown off because of these sicknesses. But anyways, thank you for joining me on this one. Hope you subscribe. Be sure to like and comment to let me know that you're liking these videos. So I'll keep posting them and know that they're worth my time and yours. Have a great day, and God bless.